Brazen Beasts, established by Daenerys Targaryen, patrol the streets of Meereen, one of the great slaver cities. Their name comes from the bronze masks they wear, molded to have the visage of giant cats, raptors, and bears. Their creation helped lessen the burden on the Unsullied, who were often targets of assassination as they patrolled. The beasts lack fear, charging at their enemies in the narrow streets, cutting them down in close combat. Thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name is Brian, and in this video, we're going to be going over the Brazen Beasts for House Targaryen. Now, the Brazen Beast box comes with 6 unique sculpts, one of which is a banner bearer, and the other is a unit attachment, the Brazen Beast Captain. The Brazen Beasts come in at 6 points, have a movement value of 6, and then on their melee attack, called Motley Armaments, they hit on 3+, with a 6/5/4 decay stat. They have a 5+ defense save and a 6+ morale stat. They end up bringing along the Order Sentinel, which triggers after another friendly unit in long range is attacked. This unit performs one charge or maneuver action. If charging, it must charge the attacker. And then the ability they have on their Motley Armaments is, if attacking in the flank, choose one. If attacking in the rear, gain both. +1 attack die and critical blow. And then the second mode is Defender loses all abilities this turn. So the Brazen Beasts are a fast infantry unit with a very respectable combat stat. 6/5/4 is a very slow decay, so they can stay effective for quite a while. Dropping off at 4 makes it a little bit difficult, but with Motley Armaments gaining the extra attack die and crit blow, if they're getting it on the side of your opponent, the attack stat isn't all that terrible. The defensive stats are... well, at least the morale's pretty decent, but the defense save itself isn't all that great. But with the Order Sentinel, the speed that these guys can get around the table with, and Motley Armaments supporting you supporting that you would like to get in on the flank or rear of your opponent, it means that they're not a unit that wants to be the ones start initiating the engagement with your opponent. They kind of want to sit around on the sides of the table and kind of exist as a looming threat when you're presenting your other things that you would like to have your opponent come into first. Having something in your front lines like an Unsullied pikeman unit, or maybe you can get a cavalry unit in a weird place to make your opponent kind of go after them, and then have the Brazen Beast kind of come in on the flank, since you have to you've used the cavalry to get into an interesting position, and then that sets up the Brazen Beast. So you kind of force your opponent to have to deal with that cavalry unit while the Brazen Beast can close in. I think these guys are a really finesse style unit. I know that Targaryens have had access to Stormcrow Dervishes for a long time, so if you're used to playing with Stormcrow Dervishes and what they like to do, then the Brazen Beasts are going to be a natural fit with just a slightly different role in terms of like what they want to do. For the Brazen Beast Captain, we get an infantry attachment that costs 2 points and brings a ton of abilities. The first one being the Order Insight. This triggers when this unit is performing a melee attack before rolling attack dice. This attack gains Vicious and rolls its highest attack die value. We also get the Furious Charge ability that states enemies successfully charged by this unit become vulnerable. And then lastly, we have the ability Iron Resolve. This unit gains +1 to panic test rolls and suffers -1 wound from failing panic tests. So the Brazen Beast Captain is in that weird zone where like 2 points is like you really have to think about whether the attachment is worth it or not. But with bringing these 3 different abilities that just really elevates the combat output, remembering that Targaryens don't have the greatest access to Warcry. It comes basically on a commander's unit, and that's it. Furious Charge becomes pretty valuable for them. The Order Insight is nice because the Targaryen, outside of like Unsullied stuff, is mostly a little bit more papery on their defensive stats. I mean, if we look at something like the Brazen Beast with that 5+ defense save, if you're going into a Sundering unit, you're not likely to have the greatest defense saves or defense rolls. So having something like Insight means that as you start to lose models, you won't lose combat effectiveness. And then Vicious is something that's nice to have within a Targaryen army because they don't really have a ton of panic shenanigans. So sometimes in like a 2-list pairing situation, unless your opponent just happens to have really great morale stat across the board between their two lists. They might have one that's not so much geared towards going into a panic-driven matchup. So Targaryen's not having a lot of those shenanigans to manipulate morale stats. Vicious can kind of catch your opponent off guard. But then having Iron Resolve on top of that, like I'd said, some of your units are going to be a little bit more paper. So giving them +1 to those panic test rolls means that if they're failing their or if they're failing a lot of defense saves and get to that panic test, they're going to get that +1 to that and then -1 wound from failing them. So you're only on like 66% going to take a wound from those, because if you roll your 1 on the D3, you're not taking any. I think when we look at the Brazen Beast Captain inside a unit of Brazen Beasts, pulling them up to 8 points is it becomes an interesting discussion, right? Because that's kind of at the point where they need to do a lot. But I think this unit does. It's just that when you look at the way the Brazen Beasts are set up, they want to be waiting and until they can unpack into something. Like I said, I don't want to connect with these guys right away unless the opportunity presents itself where my opponent's given me like a side or rear charge. I really like to try and leverage Sentinel to get the most out of them. So having a 2-point attachment on a unit that I want to wait and kind of spring a trap on someone feels like it's maybe a little bit like I'm spending too many points for something that's not extremely active until they actually start to get the chance to unpack. And if your opponent's smart, they could play around that and stop you from being able to kind of spring that trap. I don't think they're a bad call for the unit. Like if they do get in, they're charging with adding vulnerable to the unit, coming in on the sides, insight if they want to roll highest attack dice value, and they're a little bit safe from failed morale tests. So the Brazen Beast Captain is not the worst call for the unit. It's just that I might have some other places for him. Following that thread, before I get into talking specifically about the things that I like to do or bring with the Brazen Beasts, I wanted to talk about the unit that I really am interested in throwing Brazen Beast Captains into, and that's going to be the Stormcrow Mercenaries. So one of the big reasons for this is that they bring the ability Adaptive. So already the Stormcrow Mercenaries are fairly cheap at 5 points, but then Adaptive just reduces the cost of any attachment in that unit by 1. So paying 1 point for the Brazen Beast Captain is extremely attractive for a unit that really could use some help from them. So they have that 7+ morale stat, which would get kicked to a 6. So then they've got a 4+ defense save, and then a 6+ morale and -1 wound makes them into a fairly formidable or survivable unit at that point. Or it takes some effort for your opponent to deal with them, where typically Stormcrow Mercenaries, I don't think people look at them as much of a extremely survivable unit or something they need to really like spend some time and effort trying to take down. And with that, giving them Vicious and rolling their highest attack die value whenever means that they're still like their 4+ to hit isn't the super greatest, but when you're rolling the 7 dice all the time, or when you're using the order and then having Vicious, gives them some extra combat output. And to kind of trail off that too, like giving Furious Charge to this unit. With Targaryens, you're likely going to be connecting with your opponent early, and then the Stormcrow Mercenaries are going to have to kind of keep up or follow up with the rest of everything. So you can either play these in conjunction with the Brazen Beasts and have them just be like the anvil that your opponent's trying to, crash up against. And then that way you've got your Brazen Beast Captain doing some work, and they're actually like incentivized to come after them because they are quite combat focused. But then you've also, I feel like as a Targaryen player, I'm often trying to heal my units, so Motivated by Coin might not be something that you get to take a ton of advantage of, but it at least makes it so your opponent they can't just like, if you're in a good position where you've been healing your units properly and don't need the coin to heal your own units, you can respond to your opponent taking the combat position on the tactics board and just use the coin to use Motivated by Coin to get some extra damage out there. I think that the Brazen Beast Captain has a really good home in the Stormcrow Mercenary unit. I wanted to start off the Brazen Beasts unit conversation, at least the synergies, right? With talking about a couple different tactics cards from the base Targaryen deck that are pretty valuable with them, at least interesting with them, right? The first one being Overrun. This one triggers when a friendly unit surges forth. Instead of surging forth, you perform a 1 charge action. And if you control the horse position on the tactics board, you get to re-roll any charge distance dice. So with the Brazen Beast being fairly combat effective, being on the side and using motley armaments, it's not unlikely that the unit that your opponent's crashed with has done some work to the unit that's been doing the charging from your opponent. So the Brazen Beasts are kind of set up for like a 1-2 punch, and maybe they might be the ones actively taking out your opponent's unit, even if it's at the top of the next turn after a couple attacks have come through. So having overrun with this unit specifically is really nice because they would be on the side or the rear and have a better kind of view of what to go after. One of the things I think people forget about with overrun is when you try to charge off of overrun, you can't pivot first to then pick your target. Your target has to be in your front arc somehow. So that means that Brazen Beasts just have maybe a little bit better of a perspective about what they can actually go for. So they get set up for overrun pretty well. The next tactics card to talk about is going to be Sudden Retreat. This triggers when an enemy unit completes a melee attack, the defender performs a retreat action. So Sudden Retreat has a multifunctional purpose with the Brazen Beasts. If you Sentinel move in to combat with your opponent and then they end up attacking the Brazen Beast because they've just been annoyed by their presence and the Sentinel moves, you're holding Sudden Retreat over their head to where you can, since they're probably in combat with the unit that you triggered the Sentinel move off of, if you're charging off the back of them, like going back behind them off of Sudden Retreat, that sets you up for a rear charge to get both modes of motley armaments on. It also can set you up to where your opponent might be in combat with some other unit that's nearby, so the Brazen Beast can then retreat off and then trigger a Sentinel charge at the other unit. So it also kind of sets you up to get the unit that they charged first out of combat and into a better position while the Brazen Beast kind of hold down the fort. So I think Sudden Retreat has so many interesting modes of play when you're talking about trying to force multiple engagements on one unit, that it's just a really great card to kind of see the weird things that you can do with Brazen Beasts. Moving over to commanders that I like with the Brazen Beasts, I wanted to talk about Bellwise the Strong. I think this is the first time I've actually talked about him in relation to a unit, but I think he offers a lot of really interesting things for the Brazen Beasts. So looking at his commander cards first, the first one we come across is Count the Cuts. This triggers after an enemy completes a melee attack if they destroyed a rank. Target the defender, attach this card to them until they destroy an enemy with an attack. When this card is removed, gain 1 victory point. While attached, this unit cannot restore wounds, but it gains +2 to morale test rolls, and melee attacks always roll their highest attack die value. Your opponent gains 1 victory point when it's destroyed. So the Count the Cuts is interesting because you're going to have that, like you're trying to manufacture that dual engagement scenario with the Brazen Beast. So whether your opponent is doing damage to the unit that you baited out the Sentinel move off of, or putting attacks into the Brazen Beasts, it's likely that they're going to remove a rank, and Count the Cuts will end up happening, and getting extra, getting plus to morale test is great for Targaryen stuff because it puts them into a very difficult to fail roll. But then always rolling your highest attack die value. If it's the Brazen Beast, they're going to be extremely effective for the whole game, and then Motley Armaments just kind of elevates that by getting you throwing 8 attack dice all the time. Otherwise, if it's the unit they're crashing into, then they really are having to split their attention between either the Brazen Beasts that are turning off abilities or getting a bunch of attack dice and giving them -1 to their panic tests and -1 against defense saves, or starting to go into the unit that they first started with that might be a little bit more survivable, and it really confuses your opponent in terms of what they want to do. So I think Count the Cuts is a really great card for springing this kind of trap on people. Next up is Good Dying. This triggers when a friendly cavalry or infantry unit is destroyed. Before being removed, that unit performs 1 melee attack action using its lowest attack die value on the attacker. If it targets Bellwise unit, it gains +2 attack dice. If this attack destroys the defender, your friendly unit is not destroyed but instead remains in play with 1 wound. So with the Brazen Beast kind of hunting on those edges, I think that good dying could be interesting for them because your opponent is wanting to, if they're kind of understanding that this Brazen Beast unit unchecked is going to, in combination with the unit that you're sentineling off of, killing units as like a little duo, like a buddy cop duo, so to speak. It means that they might be wanting to try and focus down on some of the Brazen Beasts so they can limit those shenanigans and not have to always feel like they're getting their abilities turned off on their defensive units. So then good dying would end up triggering off on them, and by the time they actually start focusing their attention after they've been attacked by two different units, it's not unlikely that the Brazen Beast could take down the attacker from that lowest rank and just leaves them in play with that one wound. And between like maybe taking like Illyrio or Tycho, you have the ability to fill that unit back up quite quickly. And if you are doing something like rolling your highest attack die value off of Count the Cuts or the Brazen Beast Captain with Vicious or with Insight, you're going to be effective for a long time. So your opponent's going to want to take these off the table, but good dying can make it so that if they're really low on ranks, they have to super think about whether they want to do that, because you could just get your free attack and keep the Brazen Beasts around. Next up, we have Expert Parry. This triggers when a friendly cavalry or infantry unit is attacked after defense dice are rolled. For each blocked hit, the attacker suffers 1 hit. If the defender is Bellwise unit, the attacker suffers -1 to defense dice for these rolls, or for these hits, sorry. So Expert Parry is interesting. I like to think of this in terms of the Brazen Beast as being played on the unit that I've decided to present to my opponent to trigger that Sentinel charge. So if it's a unit like Unsullied or something like that, you're able to just have a decent defense save, so you're likely to block hits, and then your opponent's going to be taking damage back on the return, and then that turns into damage for the Brazen Beast. It's a little easier for them to cut through. So you can start to see the compounding ways that you have of doing so much extra damage to this one unit, to where if your opponent connects with that unit that you've presented as the Sentinel trigger, they're going to have a very difficult time wanting to do anything against Bellwise the Strong. Expert Parry is just a really phenomenal card for trying to enable that damned if you do, damned if you don't play. So now we've got Pathetic Attempt. This triggers when a friendly unit passes a panic test from being attacked. The attacker becomes panicked, and if the defender was Bellwise unit, the attacker also suffers 1 wound for each of the defender's remaining ranks. Now if you're setting up Bellwise as your Sentinel baiter, then this is a pretty decent card to put on them. Likely he's going to be in a unit that has a pretty solid morale stat, and getting your opponent panicked is nice to set up the Brazen Beasts for a charge on the side, and if they do happen to have a Brazen Beast captain in them, then you're able to use that panic die, or the panicked token, to your advantage. The thing that I really like about Pathetic Attempt is that it is the card that Bellwise switches out for one of the base tactics deck, and he takes field control out, and I think with this style of army, the one with Bellwise and what he brings and what the Brazen Beasts are trying to do, I don't really feel like field control is the most important card to that style of game plan. It's nice to get the extra 3-inch shift on your opponent's turn, or getting the extension from moving with one of your other units with that maneuver zone, but it's not super duper necessary. It's not like you're going to be losing something like Overrun or Sudden Retreat, which I feel like are the more important cards to this Brazen Beast game plan. Now getting to Bellwise Commander attachment, we have Bellwise the Strong bringing the Order Taunt. This triggers when an enemy in short range activates. If that enemy can charge this unit, it performs 1 morale test with -1 to their roll for each remaining rank in this unit. On a failure, it performs 1 charge action on this unit. He also brings the ability Hardened. Each time an enemy is performing an attack on this unit, after rolling defense dice, this unit blocks 1 hit for each one of its destroyed ranks. So this is where I think a lot of times when I talk about units, the commander ends up getting into the unit that we're talking about. But for this one, this is where I think Bellwise wants to run into a unit wants to run in a unit that's next to the Brazen Beasts, because I have not really been super impressed with the ability Taunt, but with the Brazen Beasts having Sentinel and typically getting Bellwise into an unsullied unit of some variety gives them a pretty good combat presence and decent survivability. I think that it means that Taunt can do a lot of really interesting things with trying to force your opponent to come into them. Like you can even start deploying Bellwise across from units that have a lower morale stat, or not lower, but a worse morale stat, so that when he taunts them, it's likely that they're not going to be able to do what they want to, and it lets you play a little bit more loose or setup-y with the Brazen Beast to make sure that they get on the side off that Sentinel charge. And then having Harden just means that that unit's going to stick around a little bit longer, and it has some, it has some like anti-synergy or scornergy with Pathetic Attempt, because you want extra ranks to do the extra wounds, but Harden makes sure that you get the extra hits in for blocking them. So I don't think that Pathetic Attempt is a bad card to play on Bellwise unit, especially giving them -1 for those hits to try and help clip through them a little bit better. But I do think that Bellwise in some Unsullied style unit is a really great pair with the Brazen Beast. You can kind of bait out some of these taunted charges and then force your opponent to trigger off the Sentinel charge, which they might be trying to actively avoid after they start to see what this like setup and knockdown style of play looks like. Another fun unit to bring alongside with the Brazen Beasts is going to be the Freedmen. So Freedmen are fairly cheap, and they really don't bring a whole lot in terms of raw stats. They've got 6 dice that hit on 5s with a 6+ defense save and an 8+ morale. They can't control objectives either with their Untrained Masses ability, and they need to be around someone who doesn't have Untrained Masses in order to stick around in the game. But the thing that they do bring with them is Gang Up. That states all friendly units' melee attacks gain +1 to hit and +1 attack die on enemies that are engaged with this unit and at least one other friendly unit. So you can set up some really interesting plays with Freedmen. Either the Freedmen can join in on the Bellwise Brazen Beast mosh pit to give them all that +1 to hit and +1 attack die, but they also can be the unit that kind of starts the engagement for the Brazen Beasts, unless your opponent is extremely likely to take these out in one shot on a charge, which honestly is not that hard to do with this unit. But it does allow you to still get the Sentinel ability off, and if these guys have survived, then having the Sentinel and Motley Armaments plus Gang Up going on is pretty nice. But I just look at the Freedmen as a very cheap enabler for the Brazen Beast Bellwise combo, and with you having a lot of points tied up in those units, like 6 points isn't a ton, but if you start adding on attachments, it can get pretty intense. And then having Unsullied with your commander, Unsullied in general, are pretty expensive. Having something like the Freedmen just gives you a cheap activation that can help enable them to make more to do more plays that you might not be able to get to quite a bit without that. Like thinking about +1 to hit and Motley Armaments with the +1 attack die means you're throwing 8 dice, 9 dice if you choose the crit hit mode, and then you're re-rolling dice on a charge with critical hit on 2s means you're just fishing for 6s and trying to get those extra wounds out there or extra hits out there, and that makes the Brazen Beast extremely dangerous. Like I definitely play that gambling game with them. Based on the length of our discussion, you can tell that I have a lot to talk about with the Brazen Beasts, but I do want to mention one more NCU before we wrap up for this video, and that's going to be Quave of the Shadow. Now, she brings the ability The Way Revealed. Quave begins the game with 2 order tokens on her. At the start of an enemy turn, you may remove 1 order token from Quave. If you do, target 1 enemy unit. If that unit performs an action this turn, before resolving that action, one of your friendly combat units may perform 1 maneuver, march, or retreat action. So Quave is an amazing enabler for what the Brazen Beasts want to do. They can say like, oh, at the end of your turn, you have this 1 unit left, and you can just guarantee that Quave is going to be able to do something unless your opponent just passes. And if that's what they want to do, then sure. It just means that you're getting you're changing an order token for some momentum and control in the battle, and I think I'm okay with that. But being able to retreat the Brazen Beast out of the combat that they're in to start getting into the rear or hunting other things is quite valuable, or just getting them moved up into position or moving up your Bellwise, the strong unit, to make sure that taunt goes off is invaluable. Like, I can't list all of the ways that this synergizes with the Brazen Beast because there are just so many scenarios where, like, maybe they've killed a unit out and they just need to get further up the table or into a different position and abandon, Bellwise unit. So they use Quave to get there. There's just like, there is such a massively high ceiling on what the Brazen Beast can do, and when you add Quaithe into that, it just gets exponentially larger because she has so many ways to enable what they want to do or what you want the other units that are enabling Sentinel to do. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. I think the Targaryens have so many unique and interesting options available to them, and when the Brazen Beast came out, I just got very excited about what they could do. I've been playing a lot of Targaryens lately, and they're kind of slowly morphing into like the main faction that I'm dropping on the table these days, and the Brazen Beasts aren't changing that at all, so I'm really enjoying what they're bringing to the game, and they are also like, after the dragon change, they're getting me away from just wanting to do nothing but play dragons. Like, the amount of manipulation and mental gymnastics that you have to force your opponent to go through with this style of list that uses the Brazen Beast to their max potential is just insane. It's a ton of stuff. I don't know yet if the Brazen Beasts are just something you can plug into any list. I really like to have a whole lot of cool synergies that play off of one another, and it just lets the Brazen Beast do exactly what they want to do, which is being really annoying, shutting off abilities, getting people from the side, and trying to help clip through combat quicker by doubling up on things. So let me know in the comments section what you think about Brazen Beasts, how you might be using them differently, or if you feel like I missed anything that was extremely obvious or pertinent to someone who might be looking at, why should I buy the Brazen Beasts unit? So thanks again for making it to the end of the video, and I will see you in the next one.